It was August 9th of 2010. I was 38 years old, my oldest daughter, Avis, was 12, and the younger pair, Joanne and John, were 9-year-old twins. I'd been married for 15 years. I worked at an insurance firm, and every Sunday while my wife and Avis went to church and the twins went to my mother's house, I took a walk. It was a clockwork sort of arrangement. My wife knew never to push me into going with her. I was an atheist and was set on staying that way. Of course, given what's happened, my views have changed. It was just a typical day. Avis gave me a kiss on the cheek and told me not to forget my coat, even if it was an abnormally warm day. I'd say it was about 65, maybe 68 degrees Fahrenheit. My mom picked up the twins, and I started down my walk. We lived off the beaten path, so to speak. Our road was never busy, and most of the area was taken up by farmland. A truck passed me on the road, and I waved. I was pretty sure it was Art, although it could have been one of his sons on his way to church. Either way, he waved back. I took a turn right onto Hensel. Hensel was an old dirt road, but it was never really traveled on except for by farmers, and today it was quiet. Good time to collect my thoughts. Every other time before this, I would turn back around as I reached Art's farmhouse, although occasionally his wife would pull me in for lemonade and gossip. But August 9th would be the day that I took the longest walk of my life. I was passing by the cornfield when I heard laughter. More specifically, it was a child's laughter. I paused and looked into the cornfield. A pair of forest green eyes looked back at me. The girl looked no older than 7, had red hair tied with twin braids, and I assumed she was one of Art's grandchildren. She smiled broadly. "Catch me!" She started back into the corn, and I could hear her giggles slowly fade away. Usually I would have scoffed at going into the field, as I'd have to cross the ditch, and I didn't want to get dirt on my pants. But I felt a little bit of concern. A small child running through that field all by herself? So with a jump that I knew my knees would feel in the morning, I jumped into the cornfield. Using the sound of her laughter, I started pushing through the corn, dry leaves scratching at my face and my hands, and dust kicked up into my face. I knew she couldn't outrun me for long. Even if she was a child with boundless energy, I had longer legs. However, I exited the cornfield in a place I didn't know. My house was nowhere to be seen. A light layer of snow covered the ground. I spun around, but the corn was gone, replaced by frosted evergreen trees. The temperature had significantly dropped, and I was thankful that my daughter had insisted that I bring a coat. I shivered and spun around a few more times, trying to make sense of this dream I had apparently fallen into. And where was that little girl? "Hey, mister." I finally spun around enough to see her peering past a branch, and she grinned. "You catch me, and I'll show you the way out." So that began the chase. Getting smacked with tree branches was by far way worse than the corn, the needles tearing at my skin like knives as I pushed through them to find the little girl. Whenever I got lost, I'd hear her laugh. She was having fun, but I was not. The wet snow beneath my feet made it impossible to gain traction, and forget about running. I'd slip if I so much as stepped wrong. With every minute, I got colder and colder. My teeth chattered so hard my jaw ached. And then I broke from the tree line into a grassy meadow. I didn't expect the change, so I ended up toppling over. The grass smelled sweet as honey, and a fat bumblebee trundled past my head and landed on a black-eyed Suzanne. It was heaven. But the Meadows place was shattered with the sound of a girl's laughter. "Aw, are you already giving up?" The warm sunlight made her glow like a tiny angel, but as I stumbled to my feet, I caught something behind those big eyes I hadn't before. Malice. She was toying with me, and she knew it. I can't tell you how many times the environment changed. One minute it'd be across the meadow, then a desert during a sandstorm. I had to rely solely on hearing her in places like that. Sometimes we'd be back in the cornfield, and I'd shout for Art to get me out of here, but no help ever came. Sometimes we'd be running across barren tundra, where she'd just be out of my grasp. She wasn't always a little girl. Sometimes she was a young teen with a gap in her teeth who'd hum sweet tunes. Sometimes she was a ravishing model in her early 20s with fiery hair and a flirtatious grin. At the time she wasn't any of those. She was an ancient crone with a bent back, arthritic hands that clutched onto her cane, but still managed to hobble away from me. She called herself Clarice occasionally. Other times it was Lolita, Dixie, Isabella, Hope. I lost count of her names too. A straight answer was impossible. She'd never lie to me though, just avoid answering any questions I'd ask her. So I knew she was my key out of there. It was in the meadow where I finally caught her. She was a little girl again, and her taunting was beyond cruel this time. She'd stop, pick flowers, run on before I could grab her. She tossed the flowers about and sang ridiculous nonsense songs, and I knew I could never win like this. So I dropped to the ground. The little girl stopped. "Oh, are you really giving up now? You're so close." Nothing. I remained still as I grasped for breath. I heard her get closer and closer. "Mister, are you okay? Do you need a break? You've been going on for a very long time." And once I saw her shadow, I lunged. She almost got away, but my hand wrapped around her braid, and I pulled her back so hard I could have snapped her neck. I embraced her in my arms and breathed out, "I got you." I've never felt so successful in my entire life, and I had finally gotten her. She turned around and smiled sadly. "Can we play again? We were having fun. You don't have to go back. We can just stay here." No way. I was done with this and said, "Nope, you let me out of here right now, or I'm strangling you with your own braids." A little dramatic, perhaps, but I gripped tighter onto her hair to make my clear point. She sighed before she kissed my cheeks, the same place Avis did before church. "Okay." And then I woke up. I was in the middle of a plowed cornfield. It was springtime, the ground churned to mud, and the water was freezing cold. I peeled myself off and began stumbling home. It was then I noticed how truly tired I was. My mouth was parched as the deserts I ran through, my body was stiff and ached like I'd ran 1,000 miles. And there was a good chance that I had. I had one goal in mind though, and that was home. I could finally go home. After tripping through the mud a dozen times, I finally caught sight of my house and burst into tears, barely able to move. I just pointed myself to the backyard. My wife should be home right about now. She'd see me and come to my aid. 2 teenage boys were on the back porch. One was smoking while the other was playing on his phone. I didn't recognize either of them. Had my family moved? I raised my hand and attempted to speak, but it came out as a raspy moan. Both boys jumped out of their skin. One smoking dropped his cigarette and backed off. The shorter one raised a hand and said, "Sir, you're gonna have to." And then his voice trailed off and his eyes widened. The eyes that looked exactly like my wife's. "Dad?" I passed out on the ground, just a few steps from the back door. I woke up in the hospital. I'd been cleaned up, had an IV running through my arm, and a woman that was sitting next to my bed, was fast asleep. A tattoo of a bird on her neck, a sparrow to be exact. Avis always loved her sparrows. I had been gone for a little over 7 years. When I didn't return from my walk, my wife reported me missing. At first, law enforcement just assumed I ran off with another woman, but when that line of investigation went dry, they realized that I'd been a victim of foul play. Search parties were made, people were questioned, but no one was imprisoned. They never found me, and life marched on. Art apparently died a year after I went missing due to a stroke. The farm went to his sons, who ended up selling the whole property to another family. A family who stayed oblivious to the fact that was the place I was last spotted. The boys on the back porch were, in fact, my boys. I just hadn't been around when Joan announced that he was now James at the age of 13. I wish I could have been there to help him become a man. I apparently had a good replacement, though. After 4 years, it looked like I was gone for good, and my wife met someone new. His name's Clark, and they got married 6 months after they met. Clark was a real outdoorsman, a hunter, fisher, and loved going camping. As I chased a fairy child through her playground, he was taking James and John out on trips every weekend and putting away money to help James afford his surgeries and related expenses. Clark had 2 kids of his own, and I was soon a memory in this house. They could survive without me. Avis was the only one who hadn't given up on me. She pursued every lead, every dead end, every chance that I could be there, she was chasing it. Stubborn girl, my girl. But she'd grown from a girl to a woman since I'd been gone, and it was like talking to a stranger who had my chin and nose, but still felt entirely unfamiliar. My wife did want to help me adjust, and kindly offered me a guest bedroom while I recovered. I'd apparently been through hell. Bones were broken and healed, muscles torn and strained beyond their limits. I was malnourished and could barely stand without a walker, and I had just nowhere to go. It was not a place I could stay, though. Clark's kids looked at me like I was some kind of boogeyman who lived down the hall. Clark and I tried to be polite to each other, but things became tense as my now ex-wife struggled with whether or not she could officially put down a paper who she would divorce. I was just in the way, but the little girl wasn't gone. Nightly, I'd see her outside my window, and she'd peer in, those big eyes, and mouth the words, "Come with me." I just told my wife I'm going out for a walk.